Thank you. Okay, the next speaker is Sierra Club Salton Sea team member Kim Floyd, chairman of the San Gregorio Conservation Committee.
Thank you, Cynthia. For our attendees, I wanted to point out that all of our presenters this evening are part of the Sierra Club Salton Sea Task Force. This task force is made up of members from 2 of the Southern California chapters, the San Diego chapter, which covers the 2 counties, San Diego and Imperial, and the San Gregorio chapter, which covers the counties of Riverside and San Bernardino. This task force also includes members from the Sierra Club California Desert Committee, the Sierra Club California lobbying staff in Sacramento, and Sierra Club national staff. This task force membership reflects how important the issues facing the sea and its adjacent communities and ecology are to the Sierra Club. While local activists have monitored and worked on Salton Sea issues for many years, this task force has been working together for the past 5 years, focused on using the club's skills and resources to amplify both the needs of the communities as defined by community members and the ecology of the area. Poor air quality caused by dust emissions from the receding sea and blowing dust off the desert result in negative effects, including negative health effects, including pulmonary disease and other ailments. New studies indicate that aerosolized water off the sea may be adding to these health risks for all communities near the sea and perhaps beyond. A brighter future depends on successful mitigation of the air quality risks by the state, national, and local agencies with responsibility. We will be speaking about these mitigation efforts tonight. So let's take a look at our roadmap for tonight. We've done our startup introductions. We will be spending the bulk of our time reviewing the Salton Sea Management Plan, why it exists, and how the state is doing to satisfy the state's commitment to mitigate the damage caused by the transfer of water from the Imperial Valley to the San Diego County Water Authority and the Coachella Valley Water District. We will then give an update on some of the Salton Sea hot button issues, including geothermal energy, lithium mining, long-term planning for the sea, and possible water importation, etc. And finally, we've scheduled significant time for questions and answers, we hope to get to your question and give you good answers, and then we will come back and talk about what actions you can join us in helping to protect the Salton Sea. So now to get started, Jenny Binstock, Sierra Club National Sierra Senior Campaign Representative for Lands, Waters, and Wildlife here in California, will be our next speaker. Jenny, take her away. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim, for the introduction, and Cynthia and Marianne. And it's really wonderful to be with you all tonight. Like Kim said, my name is Jenny Binstock. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for Sierra Club's National Lands, Water, Wildlife campaign. I am going to kick off a discussion about what is the Salton Sea Management Plan and what's happening with actions around the sea to date. Next slide, please. So key to understanding the past, present, and future of actions taken to address the growing crisis at the Salton Sea is the Salton Sea Management Plan. And Erin and I are going to spend some time breaking down the basics of this plan for you tonight. So in 2017, water transfers from the Imperial Irrigation District in San Diego County ended that had been utilized since 2003 to address reduced water inflows to the Salton Sea. As a result, the sea has been receding at a more accelerated rate, worsening the public health and environmental crisis there. As a response to ending those water transfers, in March 2017, the state finalized the Salton Sea Management Plan, or the SSMP. I will use that acronym to shorten words tonight, to guide efforts that address the impacts of diverting this water away from the sea and to protect ecosystems and human health. The SSMP has 2 phases of development, with the current focus being the 10-year plan, which is its first phase. And this will guide the implementation of projects by the California Natural Resources Agency, the agency responsible for the SSMP. And the goal of the SSMP is to cover almost 30, back to the first slide, or sorry, thanks. The goal of the SSMP is to cover almost 30,000 acres of exposed playa by 2029, which you can see in this chart here. But unfortunately, the state of California has severely lagged behind meeting those goals. Progress has been hindered by slow planning and implementation efforts and ongoing disagreements around easements and liability issues between the state and local landowners. So while the 10-year plan has a goal of, by now, having covered 7,000 acres of playa, we've only seen about 522 acres completed of desert pupfish habitat and dust suppression projects to date. Next slide, please.
That's pretty pathetic.
And just a reminder to please mute if you are not already muted. Thank you so much. All right, so every year, the California Natural Resources Agency, again, the agency responsible for the SSMP, must provide a status update to the State Water Resources Control Board in the form of an annual report. And that's accompanied by a public meeting, which is hosted by the State Water Resources Control Board. And the Water Board is the agency responsible for monitoring CNRA's progress on the implementation of the SSMP. So this report is really one of the most important opportunities for the public to understand what progress has or has not been made at the Salton Sea in the previous year. So the annual public meeting where the California Natural Resources Agency presents its update to the Water Board is next Wednesday. And we are hoping that some of you can join us for that meeting to make public comments in support of the Salton Sea. This meeting is a really important opportunity for people around California, all over the state, to show that they care about what's happening at the Salton Sea and to hold the state accountable to its commitments. Some more positive highlights that, when we've read through the annual report for this year that we've found. So there's been groundbreaking of the largest restoration project in the history of the Salton Sea, which is called the Species Conservation Habitat Project. There are growing partnerships to advance several community-oriented restoration projects around the sea. They're beginning vegetation enhancement on exposed lakebed to reduce dust emissions. And there was a big success last year in securing commitment from state leaders for an additional $220 million in funding for the Salton Sea. However, despite these important developments, some major concerns around the SSMP remain. And Erin and I are going to spend some time next sharing those with you. The Newsom administration has indeed shown a stronger commitment to the Salton Sea than previous administrations. So there is some momentum to build on. And we see our task and our task, along with the many partners from local communities, from statewide environmental organizations, at next week's meeting is to both uplift and commend the progress that is being made, by the state to catch up on projects, while also expressing concern and pressing urgency around some major shortcomings that we feel have to be addressed in the next year. So next slide, please. Great, thank you so much. So let's get into what we have seen in the annual report for this year. What the status update is at the sea. So let's talk about public health first. As we've been discussing, the Salton Sea is very much an environmental justice issue for communities who live nearby, communities who are largely disadvantaged, low-income communities of color, who suffer from heightened rates of asthma and other respiratory ailments due to the harmful dust that's kicked up from the exposed playa. Efforts of the SSMP to meaningfully address public health impacts are some of our greatest concerns with this year's annual report. So currently there are no consistent long-term investigations of air quality or water quality to inform the design of SSMP projects. And with so many projects in the pipeline to be built, we really need the state to provide leadership that creates real data-driven benchmarks for success so that SSMP projects can really show that there are meaningful improvements in public health outcomes for communities when these projects are built. So moving forward, we recommend that the state work to address these gaps in data and collaborate with other implementing and regulatory agencies. We recommend they prioritize a plan of action that centers epidemiological studies and comprehensive air and water quality monitoring to ensure that the health of local communities is prioritized within these projects. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. So also, so we work as part of a local environmental justice campaign with Alianza Coachella Valley and other local partners. And a big focus of our work in this local environmental justice coalition is both community engagement as well as looking at the opportunity for improved infrastructure and amenities. So for SSMP projects to be successful, the community needs to be active partners in informing the design and the implementation of projects and advising on how these projects can best meet local needs. Meaningful engagement of communities living around the Salton Sea has been one of the most challenging aspects of the SSMP. Many households in the region are very challenging to reach. They don't have the capacity to engage in this very complex endeavor. They aren't given basic information that they need to be effective partners with the state. The Natural Resources Agency is to be commended for efforts that we've seen over the past year to improve community engagement, which they've done by scaling up local staffing. They are hosting a lot more public meetings than they have in the past, and they've started reconvening stakeholder committees. But a specific engagement plan, an actual strategic plan, still doesn't exist. And we need that to go beyond these types of actions. Any engagement plan should, for the community, really should include specifics about how and when community knowledge can influence the state's plans. There should be clear metrics and goals and outcomes for how the community is being engaged to measure success. There needs to be really clear feedback loops that demonstrate to the community that their input is being received and considered and integrated into planning. And there overall just needs to be really clear communication around what are the specific actual points in project design and the planning process where community input is most influential and beneficial. And the last thing I'll say, in addition to the topic of engagement, communities living around the Salton Sea want SSMP projects to address historic areas of neglect in the region by supporting things like economic development, recreational opportunities, and basic infrastructure investments. Communities continue to request investment in amenities like walking paths, lighting, parks, community gathering spaces, and many more things. And in the last year, it has been encouraging that we've seen growing conversations from the California Natural Resources Agency about the need to for a strategy that leverages SSMP projects to create greater investments and produce these kinds of amenities. But there's still no tangible avenues to actually advance community amenities and projects. So, you know, we need to ask for that still. It's important that these ideas become concrete commitments next year. So with that said, I'm going to hand off things to my colleague, Erin Wooley, who's a policy advocate with Sierra Club California, based in Sacramento, to take you through the rest of what we found in this year's annual update. Take it away, Erin.
Thank you, Jenny, and good evening, everyone. My name is Erin Wooley. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be covering the rest of the SSMP annual report, which includes our review of the projects, planning, and funding. First off, we're going to start looking at I believe there should be one more slide. I apologize. There we go. I'll start off with projects. So as Jenny mentioned, the Salton Sea Management Program's progress is measured by the acreage of completed projects in any given year. So annual acreage targets are set to ensure the completion of nearly 30,000 acres of habitat and dust suppression projects by the end of 2028. And as we've already discussed, CNRA is really behind on meeting these targets. According to these targets, 3,500 acres of dust suppression and habitat restoration should have been completed in 2021. And instead, the agency was able to complete 22 acres of habitat restoration and 500 acres of dust suppression projects. One of the factors that CNRA is citing that is a cause of delays to project construction is difficulty in securing land access agreements. The state owns very little land at the Salton Sea and instead has to rely on cooperation from landowners to obtain access to project sites and implement the projects. The SSMP team recently completed agreements with the Bureau of Reclamation to implement approximately 1,700 acres of projects. And in the report, they discussed that they're working on securing agreements with Imperial Irrigation District and other landowners. We recognize that CNRA is working really hard to cure the project deficit, and the annual report lays out an ambitious plan to catch up on the acreage deficit by 2024. However, we are concerned that there is a significant deficit, and CNRA will have to continue working to secure access to the remaining project areas, obtain environmental permits, and secure necessary water resources to ensure that they can maintain momentum and catch up on the anticipated timeline. The next slide is going to discuss our recommendations for the state's planning process to ensure that CNRA can continue to meet its targets and commitments. Next slide, please. CNRA has made an effort to pursue projects that will meet milestones and address failures to meet acreage targets to date within the next 2 years. However, there is not a project pipeline that will meet acreage requirements for 2025 and beyond, which raises concerns that the SSMP is at risk of falling behind on its schedule again. This is why we're asking CNRA to prioritize creating a multi-year project pipeline to ensure that those future milestones will be met. A pipeline should include information on, again, the environmental permits, projected water demand, and anticipated timelines for construction. Furthermore, CNRA needs to create a water budget. Water supply and availability is essential for habitat construction and some dust suppression projects. And while CNRA has recognized the need to secure water sources for future projects, they haven't estimated anticipated water demands or identified potential water sources for these projects. With projects dependent upon this resource, CNRA really needs to begin planning for both short and long-term water needs at the Salton Sea to ensure that project construction and maintenance of projects in the future is possible. Finally, we are encouraged that long-range planning for the future of the Salton Sea beyond 2028 is underway. CNRA has convened a long-range planning committee to communicate with the public and interested stakeholders and provide recommendations to the SSMP. However, the role of the committee and their influence on the long-range plan are unclear, and we urge SSMP to develop a long-range plan with meaningful involvement from the committee that includes clear goals and metrics for success, and look forward to the draft plans released later this year. Next slide, please. Thank you. Finally, the state has made really impressive progress in securing funding. However, we're concerned about the lack of funding for future needs and a lack of transparency around expenditures. The annual report offers a general breakdown of funding sources and expenditures for the SSMP, but the report does not include a detailed budget and doesn't clearly describe how funds are being spent or what funding is needed to meet the SSMP's future project goals. Additionally, projects need to be maintained once they're constructed, with funds dedicated to that purpose. To date, the SSMP has not provided an estimation of operation and maintenance costs, which raises questions about how they're going to be able to maintain projects of the Salton Sea in the long run. To address this, we urge the SSMP to provide clear and transparent budgeting for funding sources and expenditures, and ensure that funding for future projects, operation and maintenance, along with data collection, analysis, and public amenities are included and accounted for in future planning. Next up, we'll be moving on to hot topics at the sea. And for this portion of the presentation, I'm pleased to introduce to you all Joan Taylor, who is the chair of the California Nevada Desert Committee for Sierra Club.
Howdy, and I'm gonna hide my face, and Danny, could you let me share my screen, please?
Joan, you can just hit the share button and it should be shared. There we go.
Okay, I'm gonna race through a lot of info. I hope I don't go too fast. So why is the Salton Sea where it is? Well, it's a literal collision of earthquake faults down there. This is the south end of the sea, and it's created what's called a spreading zone, and it's dropped the Salton Sink, where the sea is, 200 feet or more below sea level. So since water flows downhill, for eons, the Colorado River has silted up itself and then turned and flowed down into the Salton Sink downhill, and then silted up that route and flowed back to the Gulf. And this has created in the past a huge lake that went all the way from Palm Springs into Mexico. Most recently, it was a man-made cut near the river to irrigate that the river breached and flowed into the Salton Sea for 1.5 years till it was stopped, creating a smaller but significant lake. But there's another interesting thing about the Salton Sink. It truly is a geological hotspot. This seismic zone brings magma close to the surface around the Salton Sea, creating mud pots, and also the potential for geothermal energy. There are 13 geothermal plants around the Salton Sea, producing round-the-clock renewable energy for the California grid. And then several years ago, someone had the bright idea, hey, maybe we can get lithium out of this geothermal brine. You can see here where the brine is coming up on the left, flashing to produce steam to run turbines, and then is eventually injected back into the ground. But the idea is in the center of the screen to extract the lithium. This is called lithium recovery. There are other ways to do this, but all America's eyes are on the Salton Sea because it seems to be a very rich source. The other ways of getting lithium aren't so great. Strip mining, mining of salt beds in the Atacama Desert of Chile, where so much fresh water is used to do the job that literally civilization cultures are being destroyed. So this lithium boom, if it should prove commercially viable, could be a huge help to the Salton Sea. That's because there are two essential ingredients for long-term management of the Salton Sea. One is money, and a lot of it. These projects are not cheap. The lithium boom could pay hefty mitigation fees to sustain operations and maintenance for the Salton Sea remediation projects, which will take a lot of money. But it takes more than money. Oops, here we skipped a slide. It takes more than money. Water, of course, is an essential ingredient. Mark Twain was right about it. Water is for fighting. So where does the water come from that flows into the Salton Sea today? It still comes from the Colorado River, but through convoluted canals and so forth, and back into other rivers and ag drains. There are a lot of straws in the Colorado. And the biggest one goes to Imperial Irrigation District, which waters hundreds of thousands of acres of farms in the Imperial Valley. And runoff from these farms is literally what sustains the sea for the most part. The long-term drought on the Colorado has put reservoirs at historic low levels. And if runoff diminishes substantially, this is the way the Salton Sea will be remediated. This is called dust suppression. Basically, bulldozing deep furrows in the receding lake bed to stop the wind from picking up dust particles and creating health hazards. And this is the cheap and easy way for the state, but does nothing for the ecology or the region's economic survival. But we do need to think about what happens if the Salton Sea drops lower. Or sorry, the Colorado does. Because eventually the Imperial Irrigation District may be either seduced or forced into relinquishing a substantial portion of its water allotment. They can fallow fields, sure, but that means even less water flowing to the Salton Sea, which is already suffering from existing water transfers. Some folks are advocating bringing water in from the Pacific or the Sea of Cortez to refill the Salton Sea. And the state has appointed an independent review panel to assess 18 such proposals. Its current findings listed here basically just eliminated a few non-responsive proposals. But the Pacific Institute took a harder look at this. And for most of these projects to import and fill the Salton Sea, the cost is in the many billions. Since most import options require 2 giant pipelines and huge amounts of energy, because the super salty water that would be created would have to be lifted back up to sea level and out. And you'd have to find a place to dispose of it. Other projects call for desalinization, again using substantial energy. But in any case, the state panel will issue independent findings in the summer, and then final ones in September. In parallel with the import panel, the state has reconvened its long-range planning committee, on which I sit as an alternate enviro rep. We've been given 4 non-import options to consider. These options have already undergone some environmental review. They are, going clockwise from the top left, I don't know if you can see my cursor, a relatively small freshwater lake at the north end of the sea, with shallow flooding and dust suppression elsewhere around the sea. Or to the right of that, dividing the sea in 2, with just a remnant lake, freshwater at the south end, and a much lower water level overall, leading to huge amounts of exposed playa. Lower right pumps salty water out, but uses it to create a giant salt crust ring several miles deep around the perimeter, with a small remnant lake in the center, and eventually needing to find a disposal site for salty water. And finally, lower left, funneling inflows to the sea to create a linear freshwater lake around the perimeter of the Salton Sea, while sequestering the saline water in the center. With the long-range plan due out at the end of the year, our committee is also tasked with identifying criteria for choosing options. Here are some of my top line criteria. But mainly we need to keep in mind, it will take insured water and funding to do the job right. And in the future, those who want to take water that would otherwise flow to the Salton Sea need to fully make up for it. By the way, you're looking at a beautiful early morning shot taken by Gary Gray, Salton Seas in the Distance Center. Gary's our next presenter. He's an expert photographer, birder, and activist. And he will now share some of his wonderful images and update us on how the birds are doing. Gary, I'll start your slides in a second. Go for it. Gary, are you on mute?
I am. Thank you, Joan. Is that, you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so now let's take a fun, quick look at some of the birds of the Salton Sea. Birds are perhaps the most eloquent expression of reality. Roger Torrey Peterson. There are more than 400 resident migratory and special bird species that have been recorded in the Salton Sea area since its formation, with about 270 of those species using the Salton Sea on a regular basis. Let's take a look at a few of the birds that are being affected in some way by the increasing salinity, decreasing fish, the lowering water levels, and climate change. Some birds are doing okay at this time because more habitat is being produced from the low flows that are further from the sea, creating shallow water feeding grounds for the shorebirds. We know birds migrate, but where and when do birds migrate? Let's take a look. Birds mostly migrate at night, which is why we don't see this massive process that takes place twice a year. In spring and fall, millions of birds travel from feeding habitat to breeding grounds. The Salton Sea has replaced wetlands habitat on the Pacific Flyway in California for migrating birds. As you heard earlier, over 90% of the historic wetlands habitat has been lost in California due to development over the past 100 or so years. Thus, the Salton Sea has great importance to both the migratory birds as well as residents who also their food for their food source. Birds are sensitive indicators of the environment, ecological litmus paper. The observation and recording of bird populations over time lead to an inevitably to environmental awareness and can signal impending changes. Roger Torrey Peterson. We are seeing those changes at the Salton Sea. So, you want to go back one, Joan?
I don't know how.
There you go. You did it. The deep water feeding birds that feed higher on the food chain, mainly on fish, numbers are decreasing at the Salton Sea as the sea shrinks and salinity rises. Fish populations fall. Let's take a look at some of these species who are leaving the Salton Sea, not of their own choosing. The American white pelican, shown here, is one of those species, and the double-crested cormorant, and the brown pelican, to name just three. Let's take a quick look at the diversity of the bird species at the Salton Sea now. This is a black-bellied plover, a cinnamon teal, long-billed dowitchers, a surf scoter, or scotter if you prefer, the snowy egret, an osprey, common yellowthroat, blue-winged teal, green-winged teal, sandhill cranes. And I'll close by leaving you with this thought. The thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Thank you.
So this is Mary Ann again. Going to leave some things with you here about, you've heard a lot tonight. We've packed a lot of information in a short time here. And the next, you are all here to find out what you can do and what can be done. So there's a few asks that we would have for you. Can you provide public comment, public input at the upcoming meetings? We would help prepare you with talking points, the information on how to join, all that sort of stuff. That's one thing that we would really like to get some folks to do today, is to provide input at the public meeting. There's letters of support at future meetings, resolutions, those kinds of things. If you're interested at all in helping, I'm going to drop a link here into the chat that will, and we also will share this information with you in a follow-up email. But this link is it's just a quick form that you can tell us that you would like to help, and that you would be able to either talk at the meeting, you'd like to know more, just a few questions on this form. So we'll drop that in the chat. If you see it there, go ahead and copy it and go there and fill out the form. You'll also get it in a follow-up email. And before we go any further, we're going to go ahead. We do have quite a few questions here. So we're going to skip back here to question and answers and go from there. Danny, do you want to go ahead and take on those questions? We'll stop sharing and ask our panel the questions. Thank you, Danny.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Danny. I use they, them, theirs pronouns. I'm the digital and social media assistant for the San Gorgonio chapter. So I'll go ahead and read the first question from Mary. Why aren't meetings held at the schools that are just a half a mile from the shore?
Thanks so much, Danny. And maybe could we pin all the different speakers doing the Q&A, please, on the screen so you guys can see us. I assume this question is referring to community meetings. I'm not sure which school that you're referring to, but I do know that community meetings are regularly held in cities around the sea.
That was my question. I worked at Seaview Elementary, and there's also a high school within a half a mile of the shore. I lived right down the street, and we never had a meeting in the 5 years that I lived down there at the schools, which is a forum for the community.
Yeah.
We never heard anything. Nobody ever brought anything around to us, nothing.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what, I was trying to kind of describe and summarize in the portion about the struggles that have existed with community engagement. And what I would suggest, and, I'll put my email in the chat if you want to talk beyond this meeting. but there is a community engagement committee that is hosted by it's convened by the California Natural Resources Agency. And it's a whole range of stakeholders. I'm a part of it, other NGOs, community-based organizations, representatives from local government. And the public can come to those meetings as well and provide direct input on what you want to see in terms of engagement, everything from where you think meetings need to be held, what sort of translation services and resources need to be provided in those meetings, what types of outreach methods resonate with you. And that space is meant to be a forum for the public to provide direct feedback, to say, hey, you're not reaching me, you're not utilizing all of the skills and the resources available to us to get the word out about the Salton Sea. So I can send you information about that, but it'd be great to collect your input and that of anyone else here, so we can be feeding that up to the state and they can be better integrating that feedback into their engagement strategies.
Yeah, well, that would be appreciated, because that school is not going away. It
Right.
would be too far to bus those children into Coachella. And so
Okay,
that school is going to stay there on that toxic shore. So something has to be done for them. I personally had to leave as a teacher because I was suffering health issues.
Thank you,
But
Marie.
the kids deserve.
Thank you, Marie. I put my email in the chat, so definitely feel free to follow up, and I can send you info about how to get plugged into those meetings and how to send the state feedback on their engagement stuff. I'd love to help out. Yeah, you got it. All right. Do we have a next question?
Yeah, sorry, I was looking for the next question actually. So can you describe this question's from Carly. Can you describe what surface treatments are being used in the dust control areas that are currently underway?
Yes, this is not my technical area of expertise, but I can share that in, I believe it was late 2019, there was a draft dust suppression action plan released by the California Natural Resources Agency that is part of the SSMP, and that outlines more of a detailed strategy for the dust suppression projects, including different phases that they're going to be implemented in for different types of projects. And there's 3 techniques named. So there's a temporary surface roughening, which Joan showed an image of, which basically is like plowing fields to kind of divert water in strategic ways to tamp down the dust. There's also being explored for these techniques the application of dust suppressant, which is, I believe, a combination of chemical additives that are used to help suppress dust. And then there's also, and these are in the phase B projects of the dust suppression action plan, establishment of vegetation, some of which, as I mentioned earlier, started this year to help suppress dust around the sea. And I know I would hand it over to my colleague Erin, because she was out there late last year touring some of the sites herself where there are dust suppression projects happening. Maybe she could describe a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And so I was at the dust suppression projects, the 500 acres that were completed last year, were all at the species conservation habitat project. And I believe my understanding is that those are all temporary dust suppression that's ongoing while they're doing construction. And I believe that a lot of that was the temporary surface roughening type of dust suppression. And I'm not sure if they were doing other kinds of like chemical suppressants or other work. They also did have some channels that were collecting runoff and doing some restored habitat sort of around the project areas.
Thanks, Erin.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question. The state failed to communicate plans for dust mitigation on the West Shores to community residents there. How can that be improved?
Adjustment. Thanks, Tom, for your question. I don't know if someone else wants to take a crack at it, but as far as any communication about plans, I think that that falls within the theme of the question that Marie posed, which is why is engagement so challenging, and why is communication not effective? And I think that again, there's a lot of challenges in distributing information to people because there hasn't been staff capacity on the ground. They've hired new staff for the California Natural Resources Agency that's based locally now. I think that COVID has presented a lot of challenges in recent years. I'm sure there are folks on this webinar who have more direct experience and who live locally that might want to speak to this, but I think this all falls down to the need for a broader engagement strategy that is consistent, that provides regular avenues for the bi-directional flow of information between residents and the state, and provides those opportunities for feedback. Anyone else on the Q&A panel want to add to that? Oh, and Tom, I see your other note, even nonprofits based in the West Shores on the engagement committee were not informed. Why? That's a really great question. That's something that should be raised up in the engagement committee. I personally, one thing that myself and many others on the engagement committee have been pushing for quite some time as part of a broader engagement strategy is actually to do a deeper analysis of the composition of the committee and who needs to be on it. And frankly, I think that community residents need to hold positions on that committee, not just folks who represent local organizations or governments. So that's one of the asks that we're consistently raising up to the state when it comes to the creating an engagement plan. Not only that there needs to be an engagement plan, but a big part of that needs to have a deeper assessment of who is missing from the table. How do we get them there? How do we compensate people for participating in that space? Because it's a really big commitment to do so, and other such things. Oh, and my dog has a cone because he has a spider bite on his leg. Thanks everyone who sees him. I'm trying to get him to stop biting it.
All right, thank you, Jenny. So next question is from Lisa. Why is it so hard to obtain landowner access permissions, and what are the objections?
Well, I've been talking a lot, so I think I'd like to hand this over to Joan, who is both local to the Coachella Valley and a longtime activist on the sea, on the Salton Sea, and has witnessed a lot of these challenges firsthand over many years. But Danny, while we're setting Joan up to respond to that, I did, when I saw that question come through the chat, I pulled up a PDF of a map. I don't know if you got that in your G chat and if you're able to share it, but that shows, here we go.
Yeah, that's good, because Gary and I were looking at this the other night. Far and away, the Imperial Irrigation District is one of the major landowners around the Salton Sea. And early on, it objected because the state has the mitigation responsibility under the water transfer agreement. It's the state's responsibility to remediate the Salton Sea. They wanted to build projects on Imperial Irrigation District land, IID, but they wanted IID to take the liability for them. And IID understandably refused. And they were at odds with the Brown administration during the entire administration. Newsom worked a deal, I think, simply by assuming the liability. And but they still haggle. Over on the lower right-hand side of the sea, I think the Imperial Irrigation District is holding back land because it wants to see if geothermal with lithium recovery is going to take off. But basically, it's parcel by parcel. Some indeed private people, but mostly Imperial Irrigation District. Did that answer the question? If so, Danny, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that was pretty good. And yeah, I saw the request. Thank you so much, Joan. I saw Lisa made the point in the chat. That map is kind of hard for you all to read. Hopefully you can see the colors. and the variations of land ownership, but we can send that out to you all.
Thank you, Joan. Yeah, I couldn't get my microphone off. Thank you.
Cool. So the next question is going to be like a combination of a few questions. I think
We get one at a time.
yeah. Sure.
If possible.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. Where'd Danny go?
So how does so how does this fit with our 30 by 30 work?
That is an excellent question. I would love to hand that over to Erin, and I might jump in depending on how I feel.
Yeah, so 30 by 30, for those of you who don't know, is Governor Newsom's executive order that aims to conserve 30% of California's land and coastal waters by 2030. This is an interim goal towards an effort raised, and I believe it was by the UN, to conserve 50% of the earth by 2050. And so I don't believe that the Salton Sea has like formally become part of the process of 30 by 30, and whether the projects that are currently being planned under the SSMP would necessarily qualify for 30 by 30 goals under the plan that the state put out earlier this year. However, a lot of the projects are for habitat restoration and do get at a lot of the same goals that 30 by 30 is geared at. So ecological restoration, particularly around wetlands, which we discussed earlier in the presentation, have been declining in California. And so I think that there's a lot of ways that these programs can work together, regardless of whether these projects are officially counted towards 30 by 30.
Anyone else on our panel want to add to that? I can add another aspect to that as well, which is that one of the core values and priorities of 30 by 30 as an initiative is expanding access to nature, especially for impacted communities that don't have as consistent access to nature as many others do throughout the state. There's also an adjacent initiative being launched by the California Natural Resources Agency called Outdoors for All, which is a more specific initiative to fund park infrastructure and access programs. And so I think that, you know, we are waiting to see the final draft 30 by 30 pathways report released later this month. Likely that will give us a more clear blueprint of what implementation of the plan looks like, and to Erin's point, how we can really leverage this program for advancing goals at the sea that meet very naturally are fit for 30 by 30 goals. And then the Outdoors for All initiative is going to be launching with a public input session this summer, and we'll have a lot of public meetings. And so I think particularly for the question of amenities at the Salton Sea and creating recreational opportunities and access to nature, it'll be really important to be showing up at those meetings and raising up the Salton Sea as a priority for that.
Thanks, Jenny. Okay, so this next question here is referring to fish-eating birds. How much have the bird populations and fish populations declined, and how are these numbers monitored? What is the current state of fish populations?
I am going to see if Gary and or Joan would like to attempt to answer that question.
Gary? No?
I can look it up.
And also, if we can't answer, if we don't have the
Well, I can make a general stab, and certainly Gary could speak to the effect on the birds. But the fish, the tilapia have stopped reproducing, and tilapia were the only fish other than desert pupfish that were surviving in the Salton Sea. It used to be a huge fishery. But as it got saltier, only tilapia could survive. Now it's about twice as salty as the ocean. So even the tilapia are stopping reproducing. And but there are still desert pupfish at the river mouths and where the ag drains come into the sea, where the water is a little fresher, less salty. Salt is the big problem, but Gary might want to speak to the effect this has on certain species of birds.
Well, I would just say in the last few years, 5 years or so, I've seen anecdotally a huge decrease in the larger birds, the brown pelicans, the white pelicans, the cormorants. We'll see what's going to happen to the eared grebes. There's some people on this that could probably answer the question better than I. My information is just anecdotal of going down there and being at the sea a lot. So, but I can tell you that way, emotionally, it's really tough to be down there sometimes. It's just such a decrease.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, we know some things, we may not know all things, and we own that. So if we can get more information to answer your questions, we will do so. How are we doing on time? Do we want to keep going with questions? Thank you so much to everyone. These are really wonderful questions.
We have just a couple of more in the chat that I have, and then we could wrap up, I think.
That'd be great. And
Danny could give you, or I can give them to you.
That'd be great. And I just want to thank Tom and John for posting more in the chat. Tom Septon shared there have been some small fish at the Old Navy test base far from rivers and drains, but only a few small fish. And then John shared white pelicans now are in 80% decline. Okay, Danny.
Yeah, okay, so the next question is, what are the main types of agricultural products being planted in the vicinity? And how much fresh water will be needed for lithium mining?
Oof, that's a fantastic question. Joan, do you mind if yep, she's already ready for it.
Oh, what was the first question? What kind of crops?
What are the main types of agricultural products being planted in the vicinity?
Yeah, it's my understanding that the Imperial Valley produces a huge proportion of the nation's winter vegetables, but I think it also exports vegetables overseas. And I don't know the nature of the crops. I mean, broccoli and green crops. So they are fairly water intensive. But again, you know, it's the ag outflows that keep the sea alive at this point. As far as how much energy would be used by the lithium, you've got to count the geothermal as well as the lithium. The geothermal needs cooling water, and the lithium may need cleaning water. Tom Sefton might be able to elucidate us, but I've heard the estimate of 150,000 acre feet, and that's about a tenth. Oh, it's about 15% of the water that's coming off Imperial County and into the sea right now. The state hasn't yet updated the hydrology on the sea, and then to me, that's a huge deficiency. We're all kind of operating in the dark with information that's stale.
Tom's in the chat, 140,000 acre feet in his estimate. Thank you, Tom. We're glad you're here.
I know that there's for the export of crops, there's a lot of alfalfa grown that is exported to places all over the world. A lot of that is for feeding cattle, and it's very water intensive.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Right, I think this might be the last question. So do you know of revegetation funding opportunities that are available?
That's a great question. Like a grant program? I'm not familiar. Does anyone else here have information about that?
Well, Audubon got assistance for the Bombay Beach project. Basically, State Audubon put together an idea to enhance vegetation on the east side of the Salton Sea, and the state is kind of picking up on that and making it its own project, but Audubon led. But Andrea Jones of Audubon would be the person to contact.
That's a state funded project, correct?
I believe for most part, yes.
Oh, Tom's saying federal as well. Tom should be a panelist with us. Great. Oh, all federal. Got it.
I do have one more question. Danny, get that
Yeah,
last one.
sorry, give me a sec. Please address the habitat restoration versus off-roaders, the main recreation in the area.
Joan, I think that's another one I'd love to send your way.
Well, I'd like to think that it's not the main recreation. It's a recreation, but yeah, off-roading on that playa is the worst thing one could do. Because the furrows and the dust impressants are meant to stabilize the soil, and the off-roaders would rip it up. So there's also birding, wildlife watching, kayaking. Hopefully, if they build a small lake, either around the sea or one end or the other, there'll be fishing and boating again. So that's my take on it, for what it's worth.
I could just add to that, on the east side of the sea, which I've spent a lot of time, and around the south, I have not seen a lot of ORV activity. It's been pretty quiet over there. It's mostly birders and campers and that type of stuff along the shore anyway. So
Does that wrap us up then?
Yes,
Okay.
that's all the questions. One more just appeared in the chat. I think this will have to be the last one. It's just, how does the present drought situation affect all this? That's a big question.
It is a big
Yeah.
question, and it affects it all tremendously. I would invite all others to chime in, but I'd say, preliminarily, it's speeding up evaporation of surface waters. It's making availability of water for projects more scarce, and will continue to do so. Compromising habitat, the success of future habitat and dust suppression projects. I mean, it affects literally every aspect of this. Would others like to add to that response?
Well, it raises the specter of more water being taken from Imperial Irrigation District, which provides 90% of the water through runoff to the sea. So we need to gear up for a new, what's called drought contingency plan on the Colorado, new water transfers. Right now, there's more than enough water to support the 10-year projects, but more projects will be built, more water will be needed. Import may have to be looked at on a partial basis, if not a full basis, of refilling the sea. So it's going to be a Mark Twain situation.
There's a lot of competing needs for water in all the cities all around, from Arizona to California. So that's another effect.
Yep. All right, hearing no other thoughts for the moment. Marianne, can I hand it off to you and Danny to close us out for the evening?
Sure. So as I mentioned a little prematurely earlier about things that you can do, I've put in the chat a link to just an interest form, just telling us your level of interest in speaking at the public meeting on the 20th, or making written comments. Just let us know that you're interested and what your level of interest is. And again, that form link is, I'll put it back in there again at the bottom of the chat. We will be emailing everyone that's registered for the call with this link. We'll send you various follow-up information, and we've kept this recording, and we have the chat copied so we can try to answer your questions as best we can. And I want to thank everyone for coming tonight and the good conversation and interest levels. And unless someone else has anything, I want to say good night.
I'll just,
Jenny, you want to wrap
yeah.
up a little?
yeah, thanks. Well, I just really want to, reiterate, thank you so much. And please share the interest form. There we go. Thank you for signing up with us. I just wanted to emphasize it couldn't be more important to show up to these public meetings whenever is possible. And it is a big commitment to do so. But we are working really hard to get the word out, to help recruit folks, to provide you with all the information, including talking points to help you shape comments at these meetings, whether it's the annual update meeting next week. There will be in May a NEPA process kicking off, which will establish environmental compliance and planning for, I think it's around 30,000 acres at the sea. There are local meetings around the North Shore projects. There are these stakeholder meetings, community engagement committee, long range planning committee, and the independent water review meetings. I mean, there is now a bonanza of meetings starting to happen around the Salton Sea. So engaging in those and working with us and our many partners is really a way to have a great impact. That's all. Hope you join us.
Good night.
Thank you and good
You
night.
all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.